It is no God for Ireland, he cried. We have had too much God in Ireland. Away with God. James Joyce, 1916. It is a well-known theory that Virginia Woolf wrote her 1925 novel Mrs. Dalloway as a response to James Joyce's novel Ulysses, the latter of which was a novel that Woolf criticized intensely in her 1919 essay Modern Fiction. While the connection has never been actively proven, the two novels have a number of similarities in both structure and theme. Both books tell the interlacing stories of two individuals, Leo Bloom and Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses, and Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Warren Smith in Mrs. Dalloway, across a single day in an important capital city of the British Isles, Dublin, Ireland in Ulysses, and London, England in Mrs. Dalloway. Both books also use a stream of consciousness style to chronicle the main characters' thoughts and feelings as they go through their daily lives. The two books also share a common feature in that even though they are all set in these major capital cities and occasionally feature appearances by politicians, the main characters are firmly excluded from power because of their various backgrounds, i.e. Leopold Bloom is a working-class Hungarian Jewish immigrant, and Clarissa Dalloway is a woman. Leopold Bloom actively fantasized about being made High King of Ireland in one of the novel's most famous chapters, suggesting his desire on some level to seize control of his own life and that he hopes to benefit if when Ireland ever wins independence from England. By contrast, Clarissa son, Mrs. Dalloway, never thinks substantially about politics because she is too trapped in the past to think about the present. However, despite these similarities, the two novels cover very different life experiences as well. Despite being a woman, Clarissa Dalloway comes from an aristocratic family of country gentry, and her husband Richard works for the British government. As a result, Clarissa has the privilege of retreating into her party, playing her idealized memories of her childhood, because there are servants who will maintain the house for her. Although she also manages the household direct. Instead of leaving everything to... Instead of making the servants do everything for her. While Leopold Bloom does not have the privilege of doing so because of his status as a working-class immigrant. However, Leopold Bloom enjoys the privileges that come with being a man that Clarissa, being a woman, does not have. Even the specific ways in which the novels execute their stream of consciousness style reflects the lives and characters of Clarissa Dalloway and Leopold Bloom. This essay will argue the point that despite the superficial aesthetic similarities between the two novels, Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway are fundamentally different stories reflecting very different life experiences. Therefore, it is foolish to say that Mrs. Dalloway is nothing but Virginia Woolf's version of Ulysses when it is actually a completely different work. The main reason why Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway are compared to each other so frequently is because both novels are modernist works written in a stream of consciousness style. It is true that both novels make use of long and flowing sentences in order to convey how the main characters view the world. Unconventional sentence structure. However, the manners in which Joyce and Woolf respectively execute the style differ substantially. Joyce's version of the stream consciousness style is fast-moving and abrupt. It relies heavily on free association and wordplay, and rarely stays on one subject for a long period of time. A good example of this is the scene in Chapter 2, where Episode 2, where Leopold Bloom assorts the state of affections with the heart and pumps, and then compares organs removed from their original bodies to pumps before his mind starts debating about whether or not there is an afterlife. This shows the audience how Leopold Bloom's mind wanders between subjects, and how it refuses to be constrained to a single topic. Interesting character. You did it! Lip-sync. The passage in question also serves to characterize Leopold Bloom as a philosophical person who wonders about life's fundamental questions even in the course of a fairly average everyday walk around Dublin. It is Ulysses. It is mine. I should say ruler of Ireland, not ruler of Ireland, ruler of Ireland, you're wrong. It's a white supremacist name. Christ, what a pink.
Well,
Things have been going really well. I already submitted one essay.
you did?
Yes.
Did you get a receipt on Turnitin?
Yes.
Did you use the cover sheet?
Yes.
And your candidate number?
Yes.
Use the cover sheet and you put in the word count?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And you got a receipt on Turnitin?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Google. This is my scroll to my counters. There's not. It is man's nature. Hardcore. It literally romantic. It's a song. We are fighting for something. We're literally. It's a general. No. Screaming woman. God damn it! We're evil. When it was blue and the harrying of the north. Of the north. Of the North. Custard. It is our children. Beaches. 6. Episode 6. Return of the Bloom Eye. Of the Judah. Joyce 87. Joyce 87. The passage in question also serves to characterize Leo Bloom as a philosophical person who wonders about life's fundamental questions, even in the course of a fairly average day. Midst of a funeral. In contrast, there is a passage in the first chapter of Mrs. Dalloway where Clarissa thinks about having lived in Westminster. How many years now? Over 20, and that her mind wanders onto thinking about the borough as a whole. While Clarissa does think about several different topics in this particular paragraph, all of them ultimately relate back to living in Westminster. Clarissa's thoughts do not wander over several different topics or only loosely related to the original thought. The way that Leo Bloom wanders from the heart as seat, thinking about the heart as seat of the affections, to the fundamental question of bodily resurrection. It can be argued that there is in fact a cultural cause for these different modes of thought. As a Jewish man, Leo Bloom was raised in a culture. Leopold Bloom because of one's thing that a priest's at a funeral. The two different styles reflect the differently gendered differently gendered upbringings of the differently gendered upbringings of Bloom and Clarissa. As a cisgender man, Leopold Bloom has always been able to go wherever he wants without fear of assault, while Clarissa Dalloway, being a cisgender woman, has been socialized for her entire life to be careful of where she goes and be mindful of what she says and how she says it. Thus, the two different types of stream of consciousness used in these two novels reflect the different upbringings and life experiences of these two characters, as well as the preferred writing styles of Joyce and Woolf, respectively. Indeed, not only do Clarissa Dalloway and Leopold Bloom differ because of their respective genders, it is also clear how they live on very different sides of an imperial class structure. As discussed earlier, Clarissa lives in Westminster, the home of the British Parliament and thus the center of the entire British Empire. Indeed, Clarissa's husband, Richard, works in the British government and is a conservative, while Peter Walsh works for the Indian Civil Service, and Hugh Whitbread is a member of the royal household of King George V. Leopold Bloom, however, is not connected to wealth and power in any meaningful sense. While Bloom is not poor, his job as an advertiser does not grant him much access to power and authority. Furthermore, his status as a Hungarian Jewish immigrant a descendant of Hungarian Jewish immigrants in predominantly Christian Dublin means that Bloom is a marginalized person even within the bounds of Irish society, as well as being the subject of a powerful colonial empire. In episode 12, one character calls Bloom a perverted Jew. Furthermore, in episode 17 of the book, where Bloom is returning home to Mali while meeting and befriending Stephen Dedalus, there is a moment where Bloom thinks about an old song about a young boy named Harry Hughes who was killed by a Jew's daughter. While this might simply be Bloom doing his usual mental free association, it is also true that Bloom thinks about the superstitious of the populace when musing about this song. While it is not clear that if Bloom suspects that Stephen Dedalus has anti-Semitic leanings, it is very clear that Bloom has lived with stories such as this being part of his everyday life for the entire time that he's been alive. Clarissa Dalloway has one very similar experience has some similar experiences in life. In addition to Clarissa being a woman in addition to her being a woman in a patriarchal society, there is also a scene in the book where Clarissa thinks about her childhood friend Sally Seton, more specifically, her relation in the old days with Sally Seton. Had that, after all, been love? And then continues by discussing how Sally had an extraordinary beauty of the kind Clarissa most admired. From this passage, it is very clear that Clarissa was in love with Sally, but they could never be together because it was illegal for two women to be a couple during the time period in which this novel takes place. It is also made clear that Clarissa feels frustrated, as Peter Walsh observes, with twice Richard Dalloway's wits. Clarissa Dalloway had to see things through his eyes, a pronounced commentary on how brilliant and capable women had to submit themselves completely to their husbands in the society of the time. This is one of the most likely reasons why Clarissa remembers her childhood at her aunt's country house in Bourton, Gloucestershire with intense fondness. It was a time when she and her friends were relatively free from patriarchal restrictions. So much so that Peter Walsh describes the aforementioned Sally Seton as a ragamuffin, and as the last person in the world one would have expected to marry a rich man and live in a loud house in Manchester. The wild, the daring, the romantic Sally. However, Clarissa and Sally, despite being two very different women, have both had to repress However, Clarissa and Sally have both had to repress their own desires in order to have prosperous lives as adult women. Thus, both Leopold Bloom and Clarissa Dalloway have had to spend their entire lives conscious of their status as marginalized people in larger British society. Neither character is able to live the same life as a more privileged person. However, the most fascinating difference between Leopold Bloom and Clarissa Dalloway is how they choose to react to politics. Politics. While Ulysses is not a novel famous for its political content, there is a heavy undercurrent of political discontent running through the novel. For instance, the character the Citizen in episode 12 is an Irish nationalist whose anti-Semitism is rooted substantially in the idea that Jewish immigrants like Bloom are not truly Irish. Meanwhile, there is a small sequence in the famous brothel scene in episode 15 where Bloom fantasizes about being crowned undoubted Emperor, President, and King Chairman, the most serene, important, and very puissant ruler of this realm, Leopold I. And it is mentioned in episode 17 that one of the anagrams that Bloom devised from his own name when he was a child was Old Labour Member of Parliament. However, Bloom never fully commits to any political ideal, and this is his biggest flaw. Bloom never fully commits to anything in his life. And it simply wanders around Dublin having stream of consciousness fantasies. This is reflected in how all the political content in his sections of the novel are either self-centered fantasies of being powerful and respected or brief musings on Zion that don't affect the actual course of the plot. Meanwhile, Clarissa also mostly avoids thinking deeply about politics despite her husband, Richard, being a politician. However, where Bloom is disorganized and chaotic in his pattern of thinking, Clarissa is meticulous and in his firm control of her own household. This is actually the very first thing that the novel tells the reader about Clarissa via the novel's iconic opening line of, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And although the novel does not give the reader any explicit insight into the lives of the Dalloway family's servants, there is a point in the novel where Clarissa compliments a servant named Lucy for mending one of her favorite dresses and then reflects that Clarissa went on in saying in gratitude to her servants generally for helping her to be like this gentle, generous artist. A firm contrast to the rather selfish, adulterous, and judgmental Bloom. Despite the fact that she is depressed and overcome with longing for her idyllic childhood at Bourton, Clarissa Dalloway still chooses to channel her energy into planning her party as a way of exerting what control she can over her own household. This effectively makes Clarissa Dalloway the clever and highly organized Athena to Leopold Bloom as the powerful but chaotic and mischievous Dionysus. Furthermore, while Clarissa doesn't express any opinions on the great political debates of her own time, her interaction with Lucy shows that she does have a strong sense of personal ethics, which is just as political as any large-scale debate about colonialism or suffrage. Indeed, Clarissa's personal politics of household management and general behavior are actually more organized and efficient than Bloom's self-serving and scattershot mental ramblings. In conclusion, the great strength of both James Joyce's Ulysses and Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway is that, although the two novels are very different in terms of writing style, both their respective styles serve to reflect the differing personalities of their respective main characters. The free-associating, rambling style of Ulysses reflects Leopold Bloom's intelligent but chaotic mind, while the more precise and detailed style of Mrs. Dalloway represents Clarissa's desire to bring order to the world around her. However, both Leopold Bloom and Clarissa Dalloway are also restricted by their respective societies, because Leopold Bloom is descended from Hungarian Jewish immigrants and lives in a colonized country, while Clarissa Dalloway is a woman who has had to repress her love for a female childhood friend in order to maintain her marriage to a moderately powerful but unremarkable member of Parliament. However, the two characters are also privileged in certain ways, with Leopold Bloom being a middle-class cisgender man, while Clarissa Dalloway is a white woman descended from country gentry. However, the true difference between these two characters is what they choose to do with both the constraints that society has placed upon them and the advantages that it has given them. While Bloom wanders aimlessly around Dublin and never commits himself to any actual moral or philosophical perspective, Clarissa Dalloway makes an effort to be kind to the people whom she employs and uses her party planning as a way of making the world around her a bit more manageable, even though she herself is far from completely happy with her situation. Ultimately, both Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway use the stream of consciousness style to demonstrate how people choose to organize their lives and their patterns of thought in the absence of traditional organizing principles such as religion. Some people, such as Leopold Bloom, simply wander through what they see as a godless, amoral world and do whatever they want, while others, such as Clarissa Dalloway, choose to become miniature gods in their own personal environments.